It is our great pleasure to welcome you all here today. We are thrilled and honored to host and organize this conference, What is Infrastructural Critique, for the celebration of the life and work of Marina Vishmidt. My name is Annette Krauss, and next to me is my colleague, Sofia Bempeza. We are the heads of the Department Art and Communication Practices that hosts the conference here at the Angewandte. Our department is located at the Institute of Studies in Art and Art Education, where Marina Vishmidt was the professor for art theory here at the Angewandte. The wonderful program today of the conference, today and the next 2 days, is curated by Danny Hayward and Roseanne Gush. And thanks a lot, both of you, for bringing together. Thanks a lot, both of you, for bringing together such an amazing lineup of speakers. Thank you. So thank you to all the speakers and you as the audience for following our invitation in such big numbers. This is really wonderful, and I'm really looking forward to the next 2 days as well. It is excited to have you all with us in the coming 3 days, and we will gradually introduce the speakers over the days.
We are coming together tonight and the coming days to discuss a specific part of Marina's thinking with which she expanded, sifted, and derailed the notion and legacy of institutional critique towards what she called infrastructural critique. Infrastructural critique in former Western art and cultural institutions is like looking under the carpet, opening the storage of white institutions and looking for food supplies or other resources, and recording the repetition of the capitalist cruelty inherent in the ways of communication, administration, and distribution of labor in the arts. However, Marina pushes it further than only looking or recording. In her own words, the point of infrastructural critique is to move from a standpoint that takes the institution as its horizon to one which takes the institution as a historical and contingent nexus of material conditions, amenable to rearrangement through struggle and different forms of inhabitation and dispersal. And in this sense, together with Marina, we ask today, what do institutional processes enable and what do they prohibit?
Marina has been a beloved friend, a precious colleague, a brilliant and witty thinker, and a person of direct action within and beyond art institutional contexts. Since her arrival at the Angewandte in autumn 2023, she was involved in numerous, obviously, educational activities. And one of them, but beyond, also, she soon co-organized with a bigger group of colleagues and students, the Movie Nights. The Movie Nights are an ongoing series of screenings acting against the continuous repression of academic freedom within institutional structures, especially in German-speaking countries, although certainly not restricted to it. Till now, the Movie Nights have provided a space for coming together, discussing, and mourning in the face of an ongoing genocide in Palestine.
And maybe an ad hoc invitation for this next Sunday in this place, in the auditorium, at 7 o'clock, we are having a movie night as part of the Film Palestine Days around the world. So many institutions and cultural spaces are showing films on the exact same day. So very welcome for the screening on Sunday at 7.
So Marina was a part and very much initiator of the movie nights. And we simply want to say thank you, Marina, for your courage, for your affection, for your comradeship.
But Marina is not here, and shortly after she passed away, I wrote a poem as an obituary that I would like to share with you, and the title is We Lose. We leave behind the restorative sleep, the agrimonia, the garden of uncanny places, the waters of joy. We lose our bodies, our breasts, our hair, our thoughtful work. We lose our nightmares, our wounds, our beloved spoken word, our botanical epithets in our hearts. We leave behind our cares against the masters, our anger towards injustice, the main theme in our life's fugue. We lose our brains, our self of word activation. We lose wearing gloves, skirts, thick coats. We lose dialectics, we lose phonetics. We lost Marina.
Actually, when we built this introduction together, I already knew that this will be a difficult bridging. So please bear with me. Yes, we lost Marina, and yet she is with us today, in our hearts, in our struggles, and our thoughts. And as Marina was never tired to mention and emphasize again and again, whatever we do as many. And so has been the work towards this conference, of course. There were many people involved. This conference could not be possible without the labor of many people, and we would like to take the time to thank you, these people, for their generous support and resources. So once again, thank you, Roseanne and Danny. Yes. Thanks a lot for the incredible job that you did in thoughtfully bringing together this program. We thank our colleagues at the departments of Institute of Studies in Art and Art Education. There have been many discussions, thoughts, and contributions in the background. We thank the moderators over the next 2 days with Alexei Kukelievich, Amanda Holmes, and Nada Heidenreich. The technicians and videographers, Fine Feinberg, Tatja Skirtlatze, Thomas Mitterberg, and Maximilian Meitz. The administration and facility and event management, and here especially Marina Drackschnitz, Alexandra Frank, and Shirley Thurner. And last but not least, we have quite a group of student assistants from the Angewandte and the TU Graz. And I would like to read their names: Meret Kaderas, James Elsey, Maria Cancic, Valentina Sandner, Anna Schossengeuer und Ronja Wolf. We come to the housekeeping. So, and this is something that we will repeat several times. Maybe some of you already saw there are some A3 papers that this whole conference will be video and audio taped, recorded. We did in the preparation this quite carefully because we would like to put it later on online for public access. So this is also the reason why there is Tatja with the camera here. There is up in the booth from the Angewandte, the technicians, so that we can make sure to have a good recorded conference, so many more people can actually benefit from this get-together. We were thinking now, but actually it's already full. So, but anyway, I say it nevertheless. There is, for those who would really, really not like to be on any kind of pictures, we made sure that this part, the left wing here, is not on the recording. So if you want to switch places later on, or if you're comfortable there anyway, or if you would like to go into the sunshine of the video, please. Yeah, and also for the next days, so you know it.
And just to say that the speakers are being recorded and the audience at the Q&A.
Ah, yeah, very importantly, exactly. I think the conference leaflets you already found with the programs. So in case you haven't found them, they are at the entrance of the room.
So I think we are ready. Thank you for joining us. And now I have the pleasure to pass the mic to our Vice Rector, Brigitte Felderer, for sharing a few opening words of the conference on behalf of the Angewandte University. And thank you a lot, Brigitte, for agreeing to do so and be with us tonight.
Thank you. Good evening and a very warm welcome to Angewandte University of Applied Arts. This university would be for sure a very different one, thinking it without Marina Vishmidt concept of infrastructural critique. How do we produce our university? How do we instrumentalize it? Do we instrumentalize it? How do we maintain it? What is valued and what is not? And what are our strategies, our practices, our procedures to repair the material as well as the immaterial? How do we support each other? Thank you so much for making this conference happen, to hear infrastructural critique via many voices, and make us even more looking forward to the publication, which I think is already due to be published very soon. Maybe not soon enough, but soon. An important publication. If the topic would not be infrastructural critique, I would say the floor is yours. Since the topic is a question, what is infrastructural critique? What is infrastructural critique? This conference will address, I'm sure, openness and provide an open space, not a floor, not a territory, an open space of memory, of presence, and an outlook on urgencies a university needs to focus on. In that sense, thank you, and very much looking forward to your keynote.
So I would like now to introduce our keynote speaker, Danny Hayward. Danny Hayward writes poetry and essays. His books include Wound Building, Dispatches from the Latest Disaster in UK Poetry from 2021, and Training Exercises from 2024. And his most recent volume of poetry is Loading Terminal from 2022. With Larne Abse-Gogarty and Kerstin Starkemeyer, he edited Marina Vishmidt's Infrastructural Critique, Contemporary Art Between Reproduction and Abolition. So this is what Brigitte was referring to, forthcoming at Verso 2026. Danny's presentation will think about infrastructural critique as it appears in the work of Marina, completed in the last months of her life during the period from the beginning of her teaching at the Angewandte until her death. Then he will outline Marina's project of infrastructural critique as a method, as a form of critique that is not tragically incomplete, but radically open, which is to say mutable and unfinishable. Danny, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I think many of the people who I was going to thank have already been thanked. So thank you for thanking them. And I just want to add to the list Antonia Birnbaum, who was very central early on in supporting me last year and also in proposing the idea of this conference that brings us together. And also Helmut Draxler, who will speak at the conference, who was Marina's predecessor as Professor of Art Theory here, but who also came up with the question, which is so tantalizing and is the title for this event. And I wanted to thank also the organizers of the student strike for Palestine earlier today for what they do and for creating a space where we could attend and learn about their campaign to get the university to take a position on the genocide in Gaza. Yeah, it means a lot to be able to attend that before this, and I know that Marina would have loved to have been there too. So this is called We Are Here and We Are In It. Recently I've been taking Marina's classes. That obviously means something quite different now than it did when she was teaching them herself. But there's something quite comforting to me in the activity of accompanying her in this way, week by week, class by class, through a period of time that I experienced alongside her and yet very differently. I go backwards in time, but also forwards, to a moment in the formation of her thinking that remains incipient, where the relationship between her own thoughts and those of others remains in process, shifting, and yet now unchangeably underdefined. The courses she taught at the Angewandte during the last 6 months of her life covered the main areas of her research during the previous years of her work, but from new angles. I've been doing the reading she set for all 4. She only finished 2 of them, and in the folders on my desktop containing her notes for the class on Kieron Finlayson's book Perpetual Slavery, her commentary suddenly breaks off in week 3, with some scattered comments on Saidiya Hartman's idea of burden freedom. Marina says there, the question of freedom is not just about the development of history or diagnoses of historical narrative, but as Adorno also acknowledges, the position of the subject within it, noting, however, that narratives very much affect positionality. So I've been going through the syllabi she prepared and trying to think about where her theory was moving in the last months of the year before last and in the long first months of the last year, with all of its distinctive doublings back and twists, like the twist in the tail of that almost final sentence. I've been catching up. It's taken a long time, but I wanted to think about how her theory moves, going backwards and forwards in order to think about in what way it was moving, as well as what direction in its final stages. Classes on aesthetics, critique of political economy, a specific enduring form of oppression, and what Marina named the conditions for it, along lines both socio-technical and epistemic. Art history, totality since 2008, Kieron Finlayson's book Perpetual Slavery, infrastructure. And it feels right to me to say that these are the main paths along which her thinking was travelling, going both forwards and back. I remember how you said in 2021, I wrote in the first draft for this, that theoretical coordinates need to be bracketed or recontextualized in the constant process of collective struggle, whose results can be minimal and deferred, if there are any results at all. And I remember the love note you'd written for us 12 years before you died, that I found in a notebook in our flat in July 2024, a loose leaf in a collapsing orange-covered book with lecture notes scrawled on the other side, which ended, everything has stopped, but I feel the vibration still reports he and I are the stop, we are here and we are in it. I start at the end and I go backwards. I've been trying to think about how Marina's theory moves, about how it exists inside of history, about how it provides a language for the history that is inside of it, that we are in, rotating in ways that are both liberating and painfully contorting. I have the materials for the courses because of a minor, but to me enormously significant act of infrastructural critique by Marina's student Luciano, who enrolled on all of them retrospectively so that he could download the reading list and send them to me back in the autumn of 2024, after Marina's illness ran out of control and she and I were moved to the palliative care ward of the Vienna General Hospital. An event that must have been terribly shocking for the students in her classes, in which I know, from the bottom of my heart, she would have wanted to apologize, though of course no one thinks she's to blame. It takes a lot of work to catch up with someone who read faster than you and who was reading for a longer period of time, but I've had more than a year now that Marina didn't. I spent a lot of time in the last months thinking about what a theory should do or be, about what a theory is. Perhaps it seems self-gratifyingly meta to talk about the social ontology of a theory, its way of being or being, rather than more prosaically about what the theory says or helps us to do. But my own primary engagement, which is with poetry, also teaches me about the significance of time in altering the meaning of what is read. I love a lot of books that sat in manuscript form in cardboard boxes for many decades after the deaths of their authors before they could be published and read and transformed. I also love, though he doesn't seem like an immediately relevant point of reference here, the writings of Pasolini, who said that a death is the epistemological precondition for the understanding of a life. I want to negate that claim, but in what we can call its negative relationship to truth, it remains helpful to me, and I'll come back to it a few times in what follows. I've been thinking about the way that Marina's theory moves, which is to say about the way that it theorizes movement, but also the resources it provides to describe its own movement, both with and without me, in the months after Marina's death. In May of this year, at the Performing Arts Forum in Picardy, I'm not there, I participated in the collective reading led by the artist Noor Abed of the writings of Palestinian prisoners smuggled out of high-security Israeli jails using the various techniques for smuggling such writings known to political prisoners for as long as there have been politics, and to me mainly through David Beresford's book 10 Men Dead, his history of the 1981 Irish hunger strike and the British state internment camp Long Kesh. Because the theme of the meeting in Picardy was infrastructure, we talked in that session about how the conditions of our own reading of these texts, in a collectively owned and refunctioned convent, in a relatively impoverished and therefore, for international cultural workers, relatively inexpensive part of northern France, could be thought of as an infrastructure, as something that is integral, and not just incidental or loosely connected to its meaning. At that event, I proposed for inclusion in the reader compiled by the organisers a text by the architectural theorist Reinhold Martin that I knew Marina loved, that she cited in her first text on infrastructural critique from 2016, but that, like many texts I knew Marina loved, I hadn't read yet. A text in which Martin says, as I now know, since I finally read his text last week in preparation for this conference. As its name suggests, this is Martin, the purpose of the dumbwaiter was to exclude black voices and black ears from the conversation above. The dumbwaiter then did not merely regulate the boundaries of a sphere that was reserved, in a Kantian sense, for the public use of reason. It helped to produce that sphere by minimizing interference and distortion and restricting transmission and communication in a manner that ontically differentiated master from slave. You can see here a picture of one of the dumbwaiters. So Martin is writing here about the social ontology of a theory of classical liberalism in the form of a mechanical dumbwaiter that Thomas Jefferson installed in his classicizing mansion Monticelli, a machine that Marina writes in her class notes for the course on infrastructure that she taught at Angewandte in 2024, though this was a class she never got to teach. The colonial era dumbwaiter repeats the dehumanization of the enslaved in object form, in a process that continues, she says, up to the self-driving car. I'm preoccupied with the way Marina's theory moves because I'm trying to understand, like you, what it is, because I want to know what is infrastructural critique. I'm preoccupied with this question, though I also know by instinct and by education that I cannot know what it is unless I pay attention to how it moves. How it has moved in my own hands as one of its editors, and moves now beyond both Marina and me in circles of mediated, reciprocal influence that I cannot predict or even always hope to follow. I know that Marina was committed to the overcoming of boundaries, such as the boundaries of a sphere that was reserved in a Kantian sense for the public use of reason, or the boundary between the art institution and its outside, as well as the boundary between art and political struggle, and also between political struggles of different kinds. And I know that in committing to all of this, she made theoretical work into an unending process, because the language used to describe overcoming should itself be overcome, in reality, should be changed by reality, which it changes in turn. I know also that Marina believed in the power of the boundary as a social fact, to use Adorno's term, reliant on an infrastructure, to use Reinhold Martin's, and providing certain resources of abstraction and speculative indeterminacy, to use hers, though these markers of ownership are themselves provisional and unstable, liable to disappear or scatter under historical or philological scrutiny. And Marina knew this too, and was convinced of the status of her own project as a collective work, carried on by many hands, and many different kinds of hands, in many different spheres, all of them with their own boundaries that need to be overcome, often by making use of them, by leveraging their different scales and syntaxes, forms and functions, levels and levers. All these partial, differentiated tactical affordances. I know that in thinking about movement in Marina's theory, about negation as transformation, as she put it, I cannot entirely remove, delete, or negate myself. And that when I think about myself as one of the editors of her book on infrastructural critique, the creator of what I hope is a dialectical image of it, of its movement at a standstill, which is the task that by rights, or if not by rights, then simply in any just world, should have been hers. I know that when I think about this, I cannot not think about editing in the light of other writers who I love who have had something to say about the way in which death is itself an editorial act. Pasolini. Editing is thus very similar to the choice which death makes of the acts of a life, placing them outside of time. I was saying earlier that death affects a rapid synthesis of a past life, and the retroactive light that it shines on that life highlights its essential moments, making of them actions which are mythical or moral outside of time. Well, this is a way in which a life becomes a story. Marina probably wouldn't have considered all those concepts to be quite right. The concept of the mythical, for example, or the moral, or outside of time, or death, viewed as something punctual and final. And come to think of it, she also had her doubts about the concept of life as well. But I take some courage from the fact that the copy of the book from which I quote belonged to her, and I'm trying to understand what infrastructural critique is, to see how it moves. I know that the image of movement is not quite right either, because in May of this year, also in Picardy at the Performing Arts Forum, I read an article by Laurent Berlant, also in the same infrastructure reader. Laurent Berlant, whose work and life and death, whose story, as Pasolini would say, I discussed with Marina while she was dying in hospital herself, and who helped us in some way to face into this. Berlant writes, movement is what distinguishes infrastructures from institutions, although the relation between these concepts and materialities is often a matter of perspective, which is so admirably clear, but also makes me realize, as Marina herself scrawled in 2002 across a master's application she'd written, in which some of her ideas about speculation and subjectivity were worked out for the first time, you have to be more specific. So how to be more specific then? What kind of movement distinguishes infrastructure from institution? And is movement its only distinguishing feature? And how else do we track the shift, or as Marina wrote in 2017, perhaps rather a drift, since the shift is not historical but one that can be observed as temporally concentrated in the wake of the exhaustion of other strategies, from an institutional to an infrastructural critique. I could start by saying that if we take Reinhold Martin seriously, which Marina did, then another distinction between infrastructure and institutions, besides the one that Laurent Berlant proposes, is that the former are dumb, and that the latter are talkative or loquacious, and that the dumbness of the one, even when it's made out of language, such as, for example, the infrastructure of the law, is a condition, as she would say, of the loquacity or talkativeness that takes place in the other. Martin. Population and education were organized in an ascending scale into a pyramid of knowledge, at the actual incomplete apex of which would eventually stand the University of Virginia, with its central organ for managing the attention of young white men, the library. The dumbwaiter moves silently up its shaft, its inhuman wooden passageway towards this apex, the apex of a social pyramid that presents itself as, or that understands itself to be, a sphere, and which becomes a sphere only after the people who have been relegated to the bottom of it no longer appear, having been mechanically replaced. The colonial era dumbwaiter repeats the dehumanization of the enslaved in object form in a process that continues up to the self-driving car. This week's reading, Marina continues, will be a first venture into the symptomatology of artificial intelligence. The dumbwaiter, this symptom of intelligence, moves up its shaft, having no idea that the humans they are apes, invisibilizes and silences needed to be replaced, that is, mechanically or infrastructurally, in order for the dining room to be constituted as a sphere, despite remaining in some other reality, the non-institutional, the real one, more like a pyramid, in which certain kinds of people at the top can talk without the embarrassment of certain other kinds of people overhearing. A sphere or a geometrical circle, a space in which all ideas of hierarchy, all gradients, apexes, and power verticals are reassuringly, magically smoothed out into the mellifluous curves of infinitesimals and functions that vanish at a point, the not at all magical language of technical rationality in which society all but disappears, or rather disappears and then reappears as something else, as a figure of speech, a fiction, a form, a notion, a circle, a curve, or a concept. It moves, as Lauren Berland accurately says that an infrastructure must, in order that the institution can stay or remain fixed and can eventually be redeemed or sublimated into concepts or notions such as liberalism, democracy, freedom, and art that seem to possess the identity of universal forms and which are no longer redolent of particular institutions, such as, for example, the old one of slavery, and even less of a wooden box and a pulley that delivers bottles of wine to its beneficiaries. So this is a lesson about the role of infrastructure, not only in the construction of institutions, but also in the formation of concepts. Silence, circa 1800, is what Reinhold Martin calls it. What about silence 2025? I'm trying to understand what infrastructural critique is, and I'm trying to think about how it moves. On the first anniversary of Marina's death, on 26th of April, 2025, a group of some of her closest friends moved through the large exhibition of work by the artist Park MacArthur at the MUMOC in Vienna, some of which Marina had remarked on in passing in her extant writings on infrastructural critique, and about which, had she lived, I suspect she would have had more to say. The Floors of Terrazzo begins MacArthur's exhibition text, also available as an audio guide with additional material not present in the obligatory A4 paper printout. The floors are marble, wood, and grey concrete. Everything is installed on level 0 opposite a large glass wall and transparent security gate. Everything on floors 0 and 1, spread throughout the temporary exhibition gallery by the building's entrance, the multi-storey high gallery, the street-level foyer gallery leading back to the museum cafe, and the skylight room upstairs. The museums open and close. If you walk into level 0 of the MUMOC, as we did on that afternoon, you see everything all at once, nothing to hide. Quote, 2 oversized blocks of soundproofing foam face off with a pair of highway sign sculptures, end quote. In the exhibition guide, the works are concretely described, but they also repeat, as when MacArthur writes, at the end of a text titled Elsewhere, that, quote, decommissioned and disassembled signs depart from this text. Temporary and preserved, stolen, covered and carried away, they're ignored and avoided, cursed, consequential and inferred. The works that are introduced at first literally are preserved and inferred elsewhere by means of a poetic paratext, an erring half-rhyme, which is to say by means of one of the central techniques of Park MacArthur's art, preserved, inferred. The highway sign sculptures are called softly, effectively. They resemble 2 massive non-reflective, or at least only partly reflective mirrors, reflecting the day's light through the windows facing the sculpture garden. The gallery text cited on the MoMA webpage, listing their acquisition, says that the US Federal Highway Administration, FHWA, declares that traffic control devices speak to us softly, yet effectively and authoritatively. In this work, one of 40 blank signs the artists have made based on specifications from an FHWA, Federal Highway Administration manual, MacArthur omits authoritative text and images to challenge the systems that determine patterns of human movement. By subverting the sign's intended purpose as a wayfinding device, MacArthur has created an object that is equally inaccessible to all, a wordless monument to the impossibility of conforming lived experience to a single structure. The signs are decommissioned and disassembled, stolen, covered, carried away. Silence circa 1800, silence circa 2025. How does infrastructural critique move? Per Berland. What is its form of movement? Per Marina. About 2 months after our visit, one of the people who was there, a person who cared for Marina during the final weeks of her life, was informed that a workshop he had been due to give the MUMOC's sibling organisation, the Kunsthalle Wien, had been cancelled after he and his collaborator, who had joined us later on the same day, notified the venue that their discussion, due to focus on Walter Benjamin's 1934 anti-fascist text, author as producer, would address contemporary events, as well as the language with which those are categorized and compared, for example, the language of genocide. After a delay in communications on the side of the Kunsthalle, notification of cancellation was provided, along with a brief official explanation. There were too few staff available to facilitate the event. Just as with, but of course analogies, as we all know, are always precarious, or as Marina would rather argue, speculative, because analogies are always unities of identity and non-identity. Just as with, then, Thomas Jefferson's dumbwaiter, as theorized by Reinhold Martin, we encounter here a situation where labour seems, as if magically, to disappear, just where you might expect it to exist in the most reassuringly abundant supply. And the end result of this disappearance is dumbness, or silence that has been intentionally produced, which is to say, in Park MacArthur's terms, a few hundred feet away at the MUMOC, or if not quite in her terms, then at least in the terms of the critic tasked with composing the label with which her art is displayed, whose contents another worker uploads to a website, which is to say, the creation of an object that is equally inaccessible to all. Two infrastructures, two sets of conditions. 1. A blank sheet of metal, deprived of the signs that would allow it to speak, or rather speaking only of itself, an object for which the apparatus of the art institution supplies a different language, reclothing it in signs of a different kind, in this case, the spontaneous ideology of the liberal public sphere, that is, the inclusive and tangibly vague idiom of lived experience. 2. A closed art space, vacated of the speakers and audience who, by virtue of their contentious, or maybe even fractious exchange of living experiences, might be said to constitute a public sphere. If we haven't started to see behind that abstract geometrical word something somewhat more mechanical, which is to say, infrastructural, a stripped back or material framework for which no second-order language is intended to be supplied, so that we have to supply it here instead. Signs depart from this text, are cancelled, decommissioned and disassembled, are taken for wonders. What is left once the talks have been decommissioned and the instructions have been stripped away is the infrastructure that helped to produce them and that served as their conditions. The large metal highway signs, aluminium, measurements overall, 181.93 centimetres by 289.56 centimetres by 3.81 centimetres, an empty room full of stacked plastic chairs. The kinds of things that Park MacArthur describes, or perhaps just notes in her work, with a close and searching interest that is based in need, or that starts with need, but which is always trying to arrive somewhere else, in a concrete movement towards a concrete somewhere else, as Marina once described the practice of negation. In my 2018 book of that title, Speculation as a Mode of Production, I explored art and financial capitalism as two institutions of contemporary life that deploy a surplus of uncertainty, speculation, risk, to ground their claims on value. At the same time, I was interested to underline how both are mechanisms of making labour disappear, using the spells of creativity, freedom, and self-investment. So here is a third way in which labour disappears in the magical circle or sphere of contemporary art, which is to say, one of the ways in which Marina's theory moves beyond Marina's own living experience, in the present. And I can guess, though I can only guess, because it's only possible to guess, or once again to speculate, that Marina found the image of the dumbwaiter in Martin's essay, this image of a machine or an infrastructure which allows some men to talk about freedom and justice, while rendering dumb some others, that she found this an irresistible metaphor for the institution of contemporary art itself, for its sphere of discursive or gestural progressivism that so often performatively contradicts itself. I'm preoccupied with the way Marina's theory moves because I'm trying to understand, like you, what it is, though I also know, by instinct and by education, that I cannot know what it is unless I pay attention to how it moves. And I know that often it's necessary to move forward, not forwards, but back. On the very first pages of Adorno's Lectures on Aesthetics, a book which Marina read in the summer before she moved to Vienna, Adorno talks about what I think might be a principle of infrastructural critique, about the role of the dumb or unspeaking in it. The underlying here is Marina's. In other words, quite simply put, that objectivity of the aesthetic, which I assume will occupy us here, can result as objectivity only from analysis of the facts, problems, and structures of aesthetic objects. And then at the end, to devote ourselves as purely as possible to the matter without adding too much of ourselves. Silence circa 2025. An empty room designed to carry signs, or rather to permit a kind of speech, to be a sort of infrastructure for speech, and yet itself remaining mute, dumb. The art institution as dumbwaiter. To devote ourselves as purely as possible to the matter without adding too much of ourselves. The dumbwaiter as critic. If I search in the English translation of Adorno's aesthetic theory for the word mute, The first result that appears is on page 23 of the Continuum edition, from the opening chapter Situation, a passage which Marina assigned as reading for her class at the end of her course on Finlayson's Perpetual Slavery. Quote, "Art is modern art through mimesis of the hardened and alienated. Only thereby, and not by the refusal of a mute reality, does art become eloquent. This is why art no longer tolerates the innocuous." In 2013, Marina quoted the entirety of that passage in an article on the social enterprise artworks of the artist-entrepreneur Theasta Gates, in an article that used this phrase, mimesis of the hardened and alienated, as its title. Marina comments that, "We can make some extrapolations here which may not necessarily be Adorno's own. One is that part of modern art's very being consisted of emulating that which is alien to it. That is, its art's autonomy was based upon a relation of troubled proximity, whether of rejection or mimesis, to the banal social, economic, material facts from which it operated at a remove." She notes in the same text that a recent exhibition of Gates's at the White Cube in London was titled "My Labour is My Protest," and that his entrepreneurial work, promoting the virtues of labour in social change, preferably the labour of others, while he interfaces with real estate developers, art institutions, and NGOs, is resolutely and unapologetically post-political. I want to stay close, if I can, to the problem of dumbness or silence here as an aspect of infrastructure or infrastructural critique, and to the problem of what it means, not necessarily, as Marina says, in Adorno's own sense, to speak about devoting ourselves as purely as possible to the matter without adding too much of ourselves. The title of Gates's White Cube exhibition rhymes, or rather clashes discordantly, with the title of the exhibition of another US artist concerned with systematic impoverishment of black people, an artist about whom Marina had a lot more to say, and an exhibition that is one of the main focuses of the book Perpetual Slavery. That exhibition, titled 91020000 by Cameron Rowland, is referred to by a mute, dumb list of numerals that serve the purpose not of identifying the labour, possessively and pronominally identified, belonging to the entrepreneurial figure of an artist-author, who talks about this labour while assigning its performance or enactment to others, but to the lots in a police auction that provide the artists with their ready-mades, a language that rhymes or unrhymes in turn, painfully, speculatively, dissonantly, with the bodies of Palestinian prisoners kept in refrigerators in Israel, and which, according to the Guardian article that details the circumstances of their repatriation, were returned with numbered labels but no names. And of course also with many, many other comparable practices of historical dehumanization. Marina also wrote in Mimesis the Hardened and Alienated about the work of the artist Tino Segal that either you as a viewer agree to the social contract of the work, which involves focusing on the immediate direct experience of orchestrated sociality, or a processual and temporal theatre of community in Gates, or you try to understand the conditions of possibility of these performances, the performer's agency, power relations in this ensemble of social mimesis, and so forth. Each perspective cancels out the other, referring any critical approach off limits or even redundant, because the distance demanded by critique breaks the social contract of frictionless exchange on which this work is predicated, just like in the service industries that it emulates. Either or. Either my labour is my protest, or 91020000. Each perspective cancels the other out. I'm trying to think about how Marina's thinking moves, and at this point it begins to move towards what I perceive as a problem of language, considered as an aspect of subjective experience. The dumbwaiter, the blank metal highway signs, the shuttered art space with its disappearing labour, all rhyme with these numbers assigned to the New York Gallery artist space as a bidder in a police auction in which, as a non-profit institution, it was permitted to purchase at below market prices items of furniture manufactured by mainly black prison labour in the state of New York. Inexpressive functional numerals that in their new context, the exhibition context of artist space itself, becomes a kind of linguistic ready-made, over which a new shell of affect grows, like a hardened and alienated crust, across the surface of an apparently living experience, yours or mine. They rhyme with these numerals, they all share this crust, because in the evacuation of ostensibly living experience, each reveals something about the material conditions of subjectivation, of a subject existing in the gap between the subject of my labour is my protest, and another subject who doesn't exist yet, who remains silent, dumb, virtual, a kind of negative potential, latent in the infrastructures of social life, like a spirit, like a gas, in the banal social, economic, material facts, in relation to which art maintains its troubled proximity, whether of rejection or mimesis, as both autonomy and social fact. On the 11th of March 2024, Marina gave her second to last public presentation at the launch for Volume 3 of the pamphlet series Diversity of Aesthetics, titled Looting, an edited transcript of an informal discussion between the political theorist Vicky Osterweil and the historians and theorists Saidiya Hartman, Christina Sharp, and Rinaldo Walcott. She proposed there some questions, prompted especially by a few remarks of Hartman's, whose writing is at the centre of the classes she was teaching the months before her death, as well as her public presentations on the latest stages of infrastructural critique. Quote, as Hartman brings up so eloquently in the conversation, writes Marina, when they do it, it's capitalism, or conservation, or development, or what have you. But when we do it, it's looting. There's a slight elision of what the it is or could be because, of course, she says, scale and systematicity have an enormous role to play. Otherwise, the question of exploitation, whether by race, gender, class, that can differentiate and inscribe the value form as a structural question would not make sense. Again, the discussion touches on a question familiar to us in the present of language, representation, visibility, and silence, and especially about the ability of constituted power, whether an art institution or a state, usually a state, to use two different words to signify the same practice on the basis of whether the agent is the state itself or its enemies. The discussion in the rest of looting comes back quite often to this problem of speech or representation, the question of muteness or silence, of what Hartman calls, in an interview with Frank Walderson from 2 decades before, the position of the unthought, and which Marina made central to her own reflections on abolition as a category that shifts across a number of political boundaries, movements against anti-blackness and slavery, against gender, against capital and its value forms. What I'm animated by, says Rinaldo Walcott in this discussion, is thinking of looting as a particular form of speech that's not assimilable to the forms of speech that are already available to us. A ready-made language, that's the forms that are already available to us, a ready-made language, bringing to mind the image of Duchamp's bicycle wheel, itself a thesis about language in general, and perhaps about political language in particular. All the language around move was an attempt to make them incomprehensible, says Christina Sharp. It's like, oh, we don't actually value this, says Hartman of the image of rioters. We are content to see it burn to the ground. Our radical indifference to the national project is on display. The desire to bring about its end is revealed. The repressed and the unspeakable are in plain view. Art is modern art through mimesis of the hardened and alienated. Only thereby, and not by the refusal of a mute reality, does art become eloquent, adds Adorno. I'm trying to think about how infrastructural critique moves, and one of the ways in which it moves in its more recent stages is towards these questions of speechlessness, incomprehensibility, illegibility, the non-assimilable, the fugitive, the repressed and unspeakable, the hardened and alienated, the unthought, the dumb, whose inhabitation as elements of a different kind of language form aspects of a tradition of black refusal, or another form of speech, as Walcott says, the refusal of a mute reality, to use Adorno's terms, or continual refusal, collective refusal, to use Cameron Rowland and Thomas Lax's, a refusal enacted by many hands and many different kinds of hands in relation to and across many different kinds of boundaries, to use Marina's, though none of these proprietorial markers really mean anything. In other words, what we're dealing with here is the question, what is critique? A question nested within the question, what is infrastructural critique? A question within a question. Finally, Marina wrote in her 2022 Humboldt lecture on infrastructural critique, slightly larger font. All these tasks point to the need to understand the concept of critique at issue in infrastructural critique. The perspective argued for above cannot leave critique in its own right untouched, with its acknowledged genealogy in the unconditional autonomy of the isolated and European-identified Enlightenment subject that rightly informs most debates around the notion in the sphere of radical theory these days. Instead, the aim is to contribute to the comparatively sidelined history of critique as a material practice of antagonism whose subject, if it has one, is dispersive, uncategorizable, and collective. I go backwards in time, but also forwards. to a moment in the formation of Marina's thinking that remains incipient, which has to do with this idea of the dispersive, uncategorizable, and collective subjective critique, emergent within histories of practical negation of the types discussed in looting, but transformable into the infrastructure of social life, banal social and economic facts. On the 22nd of February 2024, Marina traveled to Troy, New York, to give a presentation at the Curtis Experimental Media and Performing Arts Center, her third to last public event. Along with the work of Margaret Rasper, she discussed there a 1981 short film by Phronsie Woods, Fanny's film. Woods' work intercuts footage of a black cleaner in New York, Fanny, talking about her life and working in an expensive gym whose customer base is sculpted white men and women in their 20s. The conditions of representation, argued Marina, in this film displaced onto Fanny, though in reality, of course, it's Woods' film of Fanny, not Fanny's film at all, are here redoubled in the content of the film, mirrors, frames, devices for the reproduction of docile and active bodies, which then go on to create the conditions for the representation of a kind of labour that disappears in its task, labour disappearing again, and thus can't really be represented at all, which is why its visibility becomes a political question and potentially a challenging one, especially when intensified by the naturalization of non-white menial labour in a way analogous, but not assimilable to, the work of the white middle-class housewife. Dumbwaiters, blank metal sheets, inexpressive numerals, incomprehensible languages, hardened, alienated frames, devices for the reproduction of docile and active bodies, white ones. Marina was herself at this point almost silent, having lost her voice due to her illness in the month before. She was planning to talk in Troy with the help of what she called, in the amazingly detailed notes of one of her seminars, this marvellous contraption, a portable microphone and speaker kit of the kind used by tour guides, the type of tour Andrea Fraser once mimicked during her famous work of second-generation institutional critique, a gallery talk in 1989. Speak to us softly, yet effectively and authoritatively, says the US Federal Highway Administration of its traffic control devices. Speak softly, yet effectively, redacts Park MacArthur, in presenting to us the blank, unspeaking, dumb and mute infrastructural conditions of that speech in the form of a metal sheet, 181.93 by 289.56 times 3.81 centimeters. Technical specifications, accessibility requirements, legal and financial infrastructures, contracts, exhibition guides, audio guides, microphones and speakers, captions, frames, devices, mirrors, administrative workers, technical assistants, cameras, conference assistants, creative class workers, lecterns and lecturers. I'm trying to see how infrastructural critique moves, which is to say its form of movement, its movement inside and outside, to use the language of diversity of aesthetics, to see the way in which it moves across and so negates, but also makes use of the existing social power of, the power of the social fact of, the boundary, which is to say the boundary between art and life, between institution and society, wage labour and non-wage labour, the black radical tradition of the 15th century through to today, and the much shorter history of Marxist feminism. In Marina's remarks about Phronsie Woods' film, Fanny's film, about the problem of the mute, the silent, the dumb, the hardened and alienated, the polished and the cleaned, about the infrastructure of a reality in which my labour and my protest, and also my body and my art are situated, a new question about movement emerges, which we can add to the question she asked 2 weeks later, at the launch for Diversity of Aesthetics Volume 3. This question emerges in Marina's thinking as a question about labour, about scale, about infrastructure. It's a question of how a movement of antagonism in the streets, for example, the George Floyd uprising of 2020, can begin to articulate itself in the material infrastructures of the institution, in the whole compositional field presented to us by the conditions for the representation, in particular in the forms of labour that disappear, non-white menial labour, reproductive labour, often black women's labour, as well as the financial and legal infrastructures that reproduce such labour as the property of a particular kind of person over long periods of time, in the long tail of involuntary servitude, as Thomas Lax puts it in Continuous Refusal, Collective Refusal, or over the long term, as Roland puts it, in relation to their own infrastructural work on time, which Marina would describe in yet another presentation in March 2024, 2 days before her talk in Troy. Some work that Marina produced in the months between October 2023 and April 2024. 3 lecture or talk transcripts, 4 reading lists, some class notes, 2 transcripts of responses at book launches, a proposal for an unwritten article, a short artist catalogue essay, some published correspondence with 2 colleagues and friends. The recursive element of reproductive labour, she wrote for the event in Troy in February, and perhaps this applies to archiving as well, or even to editorial work, is somehow not a representational one. It conveys process and is always an offcut of ongoingness, never a condition or even an object of representation. These films are cutouts off the running thread of the time of this spiral into an unknown future, as per Margaret Rasper. A couple of weeks ago, I travelled to Glasgow to give a talk at the School of Art. The topic was Marina's work and a published conversation between the two of us from late 2021, broken off unfinished and then returned to me by me alone, edited and published in an abbreviated form 2 months after her death. With my host, I visited 2 tiny exhibitions inspired by her writing in independently run galleries in the Southside neighbourhood of Pollokshields. Small shopfront spaces, refurbished by the unpaid labour of their founders, the opposite of the Mumok with its 700 square metres of 5-metre-high column-free, uninterrupted exhibition areas, one on top of the other, which can be subdivided as required, or the Kunsthalle with its large pools of paid labour that seem sometimes as if magically to disappear. One of the pieces showing in the exhibition was a collectively made film by the group Channels, titled This is a Window, narrated by Marina in 2017, which I wrote about in an introduction to her book. There she is, looking through the hatch in her kitchen. Another is a film by Park MacArthur, a one-channel video installation in which another voice narrates, to gentle but insistent musical accompaniment, several variations of a story about 2 people, named Crip 0 and Crip 1, taking a day trip to the beach. A third work in the exhibition by the artist Dora Badour consisted of a discarded blue cardboard packing case for bottles of Nicolas Fouillet champagne, retrieved by the artist on New Year's Day from the streets of the financial district of Manhattan, and repurposed as a dysfunctional DIY television. Its distorting screen a Fresnel lens, its function to display for as long as it is switched on a short loop of, quote, artificially restored and coloured scenes of Marcel L'Herbier's 1928 silent film, L'Argent, depicting scenes of stock trading on the Paris Stock Exchange. I'm suggesting that Marina's answer to the concern about the recuperation of critique is that this worry about recuperation is really a worry about representation, that it dissolves at the point at which the dispersive, uncategorizable, and collective subject of this other language takes on an infrastructural dimension, as she would say, in the refusal of a mute reality, in the transition from the representational to the language of the banal, social, economic, material facts, which are only accumulated in the work of theastigates, which can also be made to speak, softly, effectively, confrontationally, antagonistically, or both, about a concrete movement towards a concrete somewhere else, using words whose graphemes, morphemes, and sinew of connecting syntax may be made out of concrete, or discarded cardboard, or the dry language of artist contracts, or the financial vehicles, trusts, and offshore facilities that sustain the field of contemporary art, or the audio description channel prepared in principle for the blind, or the ASL interpretation for the deaf and the dumb, and finally from the forms of organizational politics, themselves transformed and not simply represented, in the classic sphere of representation, in art. These hard, inexpressive, incomprehensible languages. I'm trying to think about how infrastructural critique moves. In the last months of her life, Marina was trying to think about this too. She proposed in a letter to the editors of a literary magazine a text in which, as she said, she would be trying to develop the speculative more in terms of method and articulating it with a recent trajectory I've been looking at in the magazine Notes from Below and Brooklyn Rail, from the organizer engineer Nick Chavez. Can we take a speculative approach to political composition through a close engagement with the empirical or the technical composition of the political? That sounds very general, but maybe a direction to elaborate. I think that what she writes here perhaps sounds not general, but complicated. And this is because she is speaking once again in a different theoretical language, not now the language of critique as it emerges in the tradition of radical black studies, but in the idiom of workerism, a minority tradition within post-war European communist theories concerned with the workplace as the locus of the political and the composition of the working class as a motor of historical change. But I think that what she's saying about the relationship between a, quote, speculative approach to political composition, the formation or the shape of political groups, and the technical composition of the political, so its relationship to technology as a material and social fact, is also about infrastructure. And that the reason why what she is describing is not simply a determinism, where the technical produces the political or creates it, is that she is talking about what happens when the technical is itself treated politically as a dumb, inarticulate sheet which can yet be made to speak. I also have to recognize that part of the distinctiveness of Marina's thinking is that she spoke several different languages. I mean, theoretical languages, idioms, all of them existing on different sides of disciplinary and historical boundaries. And that while she was always interested in, quote, making the connection at a systematic level, end quote, as she put it in discussion with Sven Luthergen in late 2023, or in The Problem of Totality, she was also interested in gaps. What she called in a text about Bedour's work from 2022, the metamorphosis of gaps. Gaps rather than voids, for instance, because a void already hypostatizes its emptiness as completeness, whereas a gap subsists in relation. A void is thus always aspiring to the status of an object, whereas a gap is in time or in language. It's a spacing that telescopes in and out of a structure and may give an impetus for connecting beyond it. In trying to build an imaginary milieu for Bedour's practices, she wrote in the same essay, I was drawn again to the category of infrastructure. Bedour's blue champagne packing crates, drawn to the category of infrastructure that Marina was drawn to, telescope into the streets of a Manhattan financial district, and then return to Europe by the medium of an exhibition in the south side of post-industrial Glasgow, where the gaps, left by what were previously champagne bottles, drunk and discarded by revelling city workers in the great fading empire of the early to mid-2020s, are converted into windows or portals, here looking back out to France again, as a financial and artistic locus of the European empires of a century before, cutouts off the running thread of the time of this spiral into an unknown future, or, quote, perforated frames, stacked and leaning as so many doors, attenuated by holes, as Marina wrote in a text from 2014, quoted in the introduction to her 2024 presentation in Troy. Bedour's crates or windows, inner vampires as she calls them, subsist in relation to the kitchen hatch between a kitchen and dining area that is the subject of the film This is a Window, shown in the exhibition space next door, and also to the one text that appears on both of Marina's reading lists for the courses she was never able to finish teaching here at the Angewandte in the spring of 2024 on Finlayson's perpetual slavery and infrastructure, respectively. So her two courses, one on Finlayson's book and one on infrastructure. In relation, that is, to the only text that serves as a door or window or portal between these two areas of research, into the banal social economic history of slavery and critique in the Black radical tradition, and into technology as what Marina calls both a material force and a real abstraction, and the political genealogy of the present. These offcuts of an ongoingness cut short, these gaps we can work with. Cameron Rowland's early work Pass-Through, sorry, those are the reading lists. Cameron Rowland's early work Pass-Through from their 2014 exhibition Bait Ink at Maxwell Graham Gallery in New York is also a kind of door or window or portal, the physical spatialization of an abstract movement between commodity and money in the form of the, or a, window between buyer and seller. As physical infrastructure for an abstraction, a pass-through, writes Richard Burkitt, in the text that occurs on both Marina's infrastructure and Black Studies reading list, is an object commonly found in the world, one in fact seen both in mass-produced and homemade forms. Pass-throughs consist of a rotating chamber, housed in a surrounding box, installed in some businesses to pass cash or goods back and forth. When used in post offices or banks, they are typically industrially fabricated with bulletproof glass, those commonly used in low-income urban areas, in liquor stores or corner stores, often made by hand, as in Rowland's versions, with basic plexiglass, as the cost of bulletproof glass proves too expensive. Paradoxically, such cost-saving measures, where one material is called on to pass for another, are often adopted in the small businesses most prone to being victims of criminal activity. The pass-through is something that exists on, but also constitutes the facticity of, a social boundary. First, this is a window, to borrow Marina's phrase from 2017, a hatch or a door perforated by holes that contains another window, another hatch or door perforated by holes, a window, hatch or door perforated by holes within a window, hatch or door perforated by holes. And the role of this door within a door, of this recursive door, similarly to the role of the question within a question, of the question of what critique within the question of what is infrastructural critique, may serve to answer, but also to block, the question within which it is embedded, depending on how it is used, posed, or rotated. is a door or portal that exists so that it can be blocked. And in Roland's use of it, this anti-door within a door becomes, as Kieran Finlayson puts it, a work of anti-art within the institution of art, existing in two versions, one of which is fitted with a sheet of cardboard, a feature carried forward from stores where between transactions, employees block the pass-throughs to retain heat or cool air on their side of the partition. So you can see the cardboard on the left-hand side. So it also has two forms, themselves almost identical, one of which is for sale and one of which is for rent, two abstract forms, almost identical, but related to two distinct economic or class or racial positions, each now window onto the other, as the art gallery is a window onto the small business on whose systematic impoverishment it relies. As a door within a door, the pass-through opens a channel between two areas, or perhaps we could say spheres, or abstract locations, within a grid, a once abstract and physical, of commercial space. It facilitates transactions between these two areas, but it can also inhibit them, and in its rotating performance of facilitation and inhibition, lubrication and blockage in turn and by turn, it suggests, or illustrates, or represents the violence that can break in on these transactions from the outside, and is also always latent in them imminently. Then again, it opens another channel between the commercial environment that is divided into two abstract areas, the area of the buyer and the seller, divided physically by means of bulletproof glass, and the commercial environment of contemporary art, between the bodega or money exchanger and the autonomous and yet also commercial space of art, in which the only large sheet of glass is likely to be the one facing the street, the abstract space or sphere of the public. Because a real pass-through is, as the gallery text written by Roland states, made out of bulletproof glass, but these pass-throughs, which are doubly unreal because they're made as art objects, are made from acrylic glass because it is cheaper. Because of this, we also have another doubling of levels, a door within a door, representing or mimicking or passing as another kind of door within a door, made from more expensive material, existing in almost identical versions, distinguished by their relationship to an abstraction of sale, illustrating a transaction taking place between two positions within one commercial environment, the space of art. This is a window onto the social conditions of exchange, which is to say the endless multiplication of levels of abstraction and representation across a spatial grid of violent exclusion, that in the end is itself social and historic, across what can be thought of as banal social, economic, material facts, all the elements of a banal social and economic totality, all materials to be used. I've been trying to think about how infrastructural critique moves, and the answer that seems to be supplied by Cameron Rowland's pass-throughs is that it rotates. That it rotates and returns to its beginnings in the invention of the dumbwaiter, this other kind of geometrical, physical, or mechanical cube, as a means for removing from the sphere of the visible and the discursive the social violence and subordination, the power vertical or the pyramid on which it depends. And I'm struggling with the thought about what this means, because I know that in searching for images for infrastructural critique that can convey to you what it is, for images like this one, or like Park MacArthur's blank metal highway signs, or Dora Badour's champagne televisions, or Franza Wood's mirrors, or Reinhard Martin's dumbwaiters, you can see another door there, or Cameron Rowland's pass-throughs, and of course also Marina's kitchen hatches and frames. I know that in searching for images like this, I'm speaking strictly at the level of the representative, of the representational, at the level of metaphors and visual display systems on which the sphere of representation depends, when what I am really trying to describe or represent to you is about the language, a potential infrastructural language, which is also a potential infrastructural subject, a non-sovereign subject or infrastructural agent of refusal, of the refusal of that which has been rendered alien, dumb, silent, outside, and inarticulate by the mechanical operation of the infrastructure, including the infrastructure of art, which is to say by a socio-technical apparatus that is always, as Marina argued, an epistemic one as well, since the lesson of the relation of technical and political composition that Marina wanted to write about in an article that she never got to write is that both must be seen at the same time, as a unity, which is to say as a principle of method. I'm struggling with this thought because I'm just one set of hands with one particular set of dispositions, and because I need you, the others who are doing this work with me, to help me to understand, which also means not simply to represent but to enact this language of critique, this question within a question, or revolution within a revolution, or rotation within a rotation, that can never just be a language of concepts and discursive spheres and procedures, even though it relies on them and on institutions like this one as its enabling constraint, as the starting point and resource base for work that will not be finished until the institution is negated, along with the long histories, the burdened and burdening materialisms that cast their long shadow across it and that make it up. I'm trying to understand what infrastructural critique is, and I'm relying on you to help me to enact this critique here, a critique which makes use of that which it negates and that which it inhabits, inhibits, and blocks. And I'm trying to see how it moves. And for now, I have no other answer for you but that it moves like this, rotating, blocking, inhabiting, telescoping in and out of relation, and creating secret windows and doors that look out onto what Marina called, in her very last presentation, given at this institution on the 23rd of March, 2024, a concrete universal, which is to say a totality in which none of this exists, an abstraction that is completely saturated with particulars, that is not static, and that continually moves, and yet which remains not ahead, but inside of us, creating new windows and doors within doors in this world we must leave, through the forces and negativity that inhabit it. And like Marina a year and a half ago, and having moved not one step further ahead, despite or perhaps because of how much and how far we have moved, is with this tentative and elementary research program that I'll conclude. Thank you.
Maybe I can start. Thank you so much. I'm really mesmerized and at the same time a little bit overwhelmed by the many movements that took place. So taking us on a road with you through Marina's, it's not only thinking, I'm so impressed to bring up these syllabus. I mean, as someone who is deeply interested in educational structures, I loved how you bring up this work of syllabing. Is that existing as a word? And at the same time, I felt like kind of like, wait a sec, Annette, are you like, who am I following right now? So I'm following you, and of course you also changed between like you're interested how the theories move through Marina's like hand gestures thinking, but at the same time you also changed to I moving with her. I thought it was amazing when different movements were at the same time. Would you maybe take us, not once again, but like the many materials that you were kind of trying to move through, no? Like also transversely kind of not offering only one material, but like very clearly and different materials. So where like, I don't even know the question for that. So
I think that's a really good question, and it feels like the only one really that I maybe have the beginning of an answer to. I think working on Marina's writing for me has been difficult because, I mean, emotionally difficult, because together with Kirsten, who is here, Lan, who isn't, we've been trying to not complete her thinking at all, but to present an image of it that you could say looks like a finished image. But in doing that, I become really aware, like painfully aware, that that we can't think like her or write like her. Not in the sense that I really don't mean it like in the sense of hagiography, but in the sense of her singularity as a person committed to collective politics and collectivity within institutions of art. It's just not possible to do. And I feel like you run up against the limits of your ability to emulate all the time. And the only way that I've ever found in my life of dealing with that is to try to take into myself or into the writing space as much of the other person's stuff as possible. Some Marina's phrases, but also all of the things that she liked, and the artworks that she was interested in and that she wrote about, many of which I didn't really understand when she was alive or overlooked. And I've had that experience once before our loss of Marina with another person who I was close to who died, where the only way I could get near to them afterwards was by filling myself up with their things, like your toy box of all of their junk, and you allow them, or the idea of them, to play with it in you. So that's been the starting point for me, I guess, looking at a blank representation of a sheet of paper in MS Word and thinking, like, what do I write? What do I say? Or how do I continue this? And there isn't actually an answer, or the only way that I know of beginning to like fill the sheet up or to find a way of speaking about or with is to begin putting stuff in, prefabricated stuff, ready-made in a way. And like lots of the artworks that Marina wrote about were actually ready-mades. That's how I think about things.
But it's so beautiful how you actually, I mean, at least for me, you open it up. Like you use, I mean, I'm just using your words now, you stuff yourself, but actually by that, you make it possible that we can maybe enter now in this gap, not void, as you referred to.
Which is Marina's phrase in the first text that she wrote about the work of Dora Badur. Yeah, maybe this is also a question about theory. Like she could be a very abstract writer, and I think that line that she writes in the proposal to the people who wanted her to write an essay about taking a speculative approach to the technical composition as a way of approaching political composition is indicative, right? I had to read that 100 times. I don't know what you mean, Marina. Come back and tell me. And it gets harder because she liked to switch between theoretical vocabularies. But maybe what makes the material approachable for me is that it always exists in this space, which in my mind is also really playful. Once you see that the things, the stuff, the ready-mades, the champagne boxes, and the pass-throughs, and the kitchen hatches are treated kind of in the same way as the concepts, as things to be played with, opened up, negated, kicked about, broken down, moved around, that all of these things kind of exist in the same plane. I think you get closer to the way in which she worked or thought, and also to what I was describing as her singularity, which is the thing that is impossible for me to emulate. It's about getting nearer rather than getting to where you want to be.
Thank you. Just to explain a little bit how we are thinking about the discussion now and the Q&A. So we have James over there with a microphone and Sofia over there. So whoever feels called for a question or a comment, please simply raise your hand and we accommodate.
Cold or hot?
I didn't make cold, like C-A-L-L-E-D.
Yeah, I know. Just like breaking some.
Hello, thank you so much for your words. I have a question, and it's not a question and that expects a precise answer. It's more of an attempt to open up things even further, and it's quite a simple question, also coming out of the observation of the many forms that the theory takes in Marina's practice. What do you think? I mean, how does the heterogeneity of forms comes about, be it the syllables, the essays, the critique? And does it come out of the everyday life of someone who does theory? Or is it maybe part of the movement that the writing moves between the heterogeneous forms that are maybe not even formats that are perceptible as a certain format that can be repeated? Thank you.
I don't see any other people here. Maybe we can directly answer that.
I think in a crude sociological sense, in the first place, it comes from working a lot. But you could put that differently and say that it comes from a commitment to like writing is something that you do with and alongside people. So the book Infrastructural Critique is, as I'm maybe accurately or inaccurately describing it, I don't know, as a kind of dialectical image of her theory, which she never got to stop herself or finish herself, exists or will exist, I really hope, as a way for people to approach her thinking on all of its levels and to be excited by it. But what goes into that book are lots of texts, which themselves often exist in many different forms, and Marina's composition, a practice of composition, maybe you could say, to my mind, was conditioned by her desire to like write lots of things with lots of different people in lots of different ways, kind of all the time. So she had very clear and systematic ideas, but they were being articulated, as I said at one point in the presentation, and the last months of her life are just indicative in like 2 different conversations with friends, 1 piece of commissioned art writing, in long notes that she was writing for her students every week, in book responses to other people's books that she had agreed to do. So there's this very fragmentary form, you could say, of the writing, which I think is the result of a social and political praxis, a commitment to doing things with others and not being the proprietor, the sovereign owner of your own theory, which is a commodity to sell on the market. But at the same time, there is very systematic thinking, not a system, but a very strong desire to like make connections between the different ideas that constitute the theoretical approach. What she says in this conversation with Sven Luttigen, that she's always looking for ways to make the connection at a systematic level. So fragmentation at level of form, because of a commitment to the social and the collective, and systematicity is a kind of desire, again, I think, to make connections between traditions, concepts, forms of approach. There was a discussion earlier on at the student strike about alliance building, and I think that was also really important to Marina. And in a way, I think what she was doing, this is again a kind of pet theory of mine, and maybe other people think I'm wrong, so I'm interested to know, is that building alliances at the level of theory by making intellectual connections between what seem like contradictory traditions. So her presentation at the Dialectics and Anti-Dialectics conference last year, her last presentation, for example, is just very explicitly about trying to do that, not taking sides, but to imagine how to make productive connections or links between 2 traditions of thinking in philosophy that most people would just say are opposites, and you have to choose one or the other.
Thank you for that very moving talk. That's also a talk about moving. And so now I'm also thinking about how infrastructural critique moves. And I wanted to ask you about this question of rotation, because maybe that's the most brilliant way to say it, because something rotating isn't actually moving. It's moving in relation to itself, but not in relation to things elsewhere in the world. And I wanted to ask that question in relation to a line that you quoted from Marina that I also think about a lot, which is, it makes use of that which it negates, which presents a dilemma other than the obvious contradictory one. But the other dilemma is, if you're using something you're negating, are you reproducing it? And maybe rotating around it is a way to keep yourself from reproducing it, if that makes sense. But yeah, thank you.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's right. I guess a criticism someone might make of this way of thinking, well, there are 2 criticisms, one of which Marina anticipated. You could say, well, it's just eclecticism, you're doing lots of different kinds of things, and they don't fit together. I think she has an account of the ways in which they do, and some of that's in the book Infrastructural Critique. So I'll get out of trying to rehearse what I think her answer is by saying you should all read it. The other criticism is, I suppose, that it's the criticism of complicity, right? It's not enough. You need to really negate the thing. In order to really negate it, you can't tarry with it or use it. You need to just maybe destroy it, or in any case, at least leave it behind. And I think it's maybe worth just stating that criticism as an open problem for Marina's thinking. I don't have a solution to it. I know that I prefer her way of thinking because it seems to make more things possible, and possibility is obviously another concept that she was interested in. I think within the history of radical aesthetics and politics, traditions that recognize that you have to make use of things which in certain respects are hostile to you tend to be less dogmatic and less self-isolating. Maybe that comes back again to the question of alliance building. And alliance building is something that you do in your thinking as well as in your political organizing. But I think it's good also for the problems to stay open, because she didn't try to solve them forever.
Maybe adding to exactly that. What Andreas asked with this question of like, maybe it's, I mean, what you were just saying, like, it is partisanship, because you need to use your life, and your life has a lot of negativity because you live in a fucked up world. So, which is why I find, like, my question is about the concrete universals, which I think are a brilliant idea. And the way in which she uses it in that, like, dialectics, anti-dialectics talk, I thought was something like an idea of alliance, as an idea of having to, that what concrete universals do is to congeal life into an abstraction, so that abstraction becomes a living form. So, like, I saw Priyambada Gopal, which she relates to in that passage, give a talk about the Zapatista movement, and like what she was talking about in that talk was exactly that, concrete universals. Like, because she was saying the Zapatistas use freedom, liberty, law, like all of those abstractions as like concrete forms of action. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if, in a way, the concrete universals could work recursively, like that everything needs to become a concrete universal. Maybe? I don't know. Question mark?
I don't. These are much too good questions for me to have answers to them. If we read the whole of the passage, then she's talking about Priya Gopal and this idea that universals are not a possession of European Enlightenment, but emerged at sites of anti-colonial struggle and flowed back towards the metropole. There is a moment of the assertion of universality in the moment of resisting a particular form of oppression. I think all of the language that you're using about partisanship and congelation is like language that I wish that she could think through. And this is one of those points where I can't really do it. I guess maybe it's useful for me to keep saying when I can't do something. It's my moment of negation on this panel discussion. But this also connects, I think, to this idea which comes back over and over again in Marina's writing about political struggle or organizational struggle. I didn't really talk in this presentation about that element of her work. Some of it goes into the Infrastructural Critique book. There's more of it there than there was in my account of it, so I'm sorry about that. But in her lecture, which you can watch on YouTube, from which this image is taken, which she gave at Goldsmiths in 2020, This is an image, by the way, for anyone who doesn't know, of a picket of the opening event of the Goldsmiths Contemporary Centre for Art a couple of years before that, where students, in alliance with cleaners at the institution, picketed the opening in order to advance their campaign for workers, cleaning workers, reproductive workers at Goldsmiths to be taken in-house and receive better working conditions. But in her lecture about this, she says very insistently that within all political struggles, there's a moment of negation, which is the moment where you attack the thing which is oppressing you, but also a moment of proposition, which is the moment where you say what it is that you want affirmatively. And there's no solution in her thinking to how the dialectic between those two moments works. I think it only happens in practice. Maybe then again, you're just driven back to the stuff that she dealt with and the stuff that we have to deal with, because it's only in relation to stuff and not in theory or abstractly that we can answer that question.
I think over there. No? Maybe over here? Maybe then I can jump in here, because I would like to add a third. I mean, actually, you mentioned it. I mean, okay, so I have to go slow for myself. So infrastructure as something that enables certain movements, that blocks certain movements, but also reproduce certain movements, no? And in one of the slides, you quoted, or you showed Marina's text about habits. And for me, that is something where I find the infrastructure gets scary for me. Also, as someone who has quite a lot thought around and worked towards or within habit construction routines. How are routines produced? Institutional routines, institutional habits. So there I wonder in how far the question about negativity is always part of this reproducing routines that we have to, on one hand, obviously address via awareness raising, and I'm kind of going a little bit also in relation to what we discussed in the courtyard from the Free Palestine group in the walkout. But also I think it's not about only awareness raising. So how do we get at our routines? And those routines that are not necessarily life-giving, but actually full of this, death drive. It's not really a question, but it's a question that I'm constantly asking myself in relation to infrastructural. And now I kind of get the gift of the infrastructural critique, so that comes at me. And as a new term or kind of movement that opens, but also at the same time closes certain movements.
Mm-hmm. And Marina has this really nice line where she says, broken infrastructure is loquacious. It's about language.
Can you say it again?
Broken infrastructure is loquacious, as in talkative, or it speaks. Because it's the moment where routine breaks down, and then you see what the conditions of the routine were, whether those are material conditions in terms of, I don't know, energy infrastructure, or just the way that you behave when you get up in the morning. So brokenness perhaps is the moment of negativity, which in certain instances might happen irrespective of us wanting to act negatively, or to enact the negative. And I think the place where she says this for the first time is in her first text on infrastructural critique, where she's talking about collapsing underfunded infrastructure in the US, which isn't straightforwardly critique in the sense that we might want, unless one means that the US state is critiquing itself by not maintaining its own roads and bridges. But maybe it is. But I like this connection between the breakdown, broken infrastructure, and the expressive, the loquacious, the talkative, I think is really integral. But maybe that's kind of the only thing I'm trying to say in this presentation. It's like a massive elaboration on that one sentence. Broken infrastructure is like 4 words. Broken infrastructure is loquacious.
I think also what Annette is saying about habit construction for me is really exciting for us to think about. And I think is maybe not how I would answer, but how I would kind of also think through what Alberto is raising about working with something that you are in opposition to. And I think this kind of like what Danny's calling this, what did you say? Like eclecticism of, let's say like an eclectic use of tools, I think for me like opens up a kind of awareness around the co-constitutive nature between ourselves and the things that we're in opposition to, right? Which comes through in the face of our habits, I think, like how we are, I guess constructed along with these things that we then become opposed to, which also reminds me of this kind of, I guess like what for me was a very important sort of pulling back of the veil that Marina did in terms of the supposed separation between art and financial capital. Like it feels like it mimics that a little bit. So habit construction tomorrow, please, more.
Thanks, Taylor, for that. I think it's also like in relation to what you were talking about, the impossible or possible, like possible conditions of possibilities. But I'm always kind of wonder how I'm kind of, well, basically lying to myself in the way I think things are impossible. But are they actually? So is that another routine of kind of thinking about how I'm trained towards certain impossibilities?
I guess the simple way of describing the argument I think Marina was making is that an infrastructure does make it impossible, but then you can break the infrastructure, which is maybe a way of thinking about another problem that she talked about a lot, which is the dynamic of responsibilization, where something is impossible for you and you blame yourself because why is it impossible? You should be able to make it possible if you were stronger or fitter or faster or better, etc., etc., etc. There's nothing wrong sometimes with simple points, right? It's often the infrastructure, the contingent, historically emergent infrastructure of habits or of machinery or the particular repertoire of an institution that makes things very difficult for us to do. Whether that's forming for certain kinds of political organizations or engaging in certain kinds of art making or refusing certain kinds of art making or just saying something about reality as we perceive it.
And especially the moment, I mean, you got me there, totally, the I, which I think is kind of like, okay, how is it produced in the we? And who is this we, temporarily or not temporarily? So how is this formation going?
Yeah, hi. I have, I think, a couple of quick questions. One is on the question of abolition, and I was hoping maybe you could say a little bit more about abolition in Marina's work. One can think of sort of multiple genealogies of abolition right across the Black radical tradition, in the kind of Marxist communist tradition, in sort of value form theory as well. And secondly, maybe relatedly, if you could say a little bit about whether to what extent you would see infrastructure in this discussion as sort of repurposable or reconfigurable. And I'm thinking of the debate between Jasper Burns and, in fact, Alberto Toscano on precisely this question, right? Where Toscano, it's a little bit overdrawn, but in some sense, Toscano says, right, one can repurpose capitalist infrastructure for revolutionary ends, and Burns says, no, in fact, one must abolish capitalist infrastructure in any sort of communization scenario. So I'm sort of wondering where you might situate Marina's work in relation to this kind of these questions.
There's another question, and then okay, cool. Okay, first Anahita, and then Frida. Okay, Frida, you go first.
Thank you, Danny and Annette. Yeah, perhaps this this goes back to the sabotage question. I think I was just felt like throwing in this kind of, speaking of reproduction, of this refusal to uphold the individual subjectivity, a kind of, you know, this immanent sabotage that is necessary to, in a kind of withdrawal and redirect the reproduction of individuality to this kind of more manifold subjectivity that is not collective but kind of, yeah, open. Yeah, I was just thinking in terms of Marina's, yes, as you spoke of Danny and what I've experienced myself, Marina's, you know, insistence in doing this, you know, and how perhaps that withdrawal or, yeah, the negation that you said is this kind of refusal of reproducing oneself in a sense, in that kind of individual subjective sense, which I find crucial to an understanding of that form of critique. Yeah, thank you.
Do you want to take one question more, or maybe now? Yes. Go.
Yeah, so about the abolition discussion and the question of abolition in relation to infrastructure, I think that's really central to where Marina's thinking originally came from around this problem. So not unusually for her, when she was involved in these discussions about the politics of abolition in the early 2010s, her first maneuver or her way of inserting herself into the discussion was to say exactly what you said. Like, well, there are lots of languages of abolition, lots of different kinds of abolition within different traditions. So the question isn't, can we do it or can't we, but what tradition are we speaking about? And then also, what are the relations between those traditions, between the historical movement for the abolition of slavery, or in the ideal horizon of the abolition of gender, or in value form theory of the last 50 years. So there's quite a lot of writing by her which experimentally and without drawing any firm conclusions opens the question of abolition as a multiple problem or an internally differentiated problem. I guess that's how she would try to move towards it. And the discussions about whether infrastructure could be repurposed, I tried to write about this quite a lot in what has become the introduction to the book, but there's a text that she cites in the first piece of work that she produces on infrastructural critique from 2016 called Error by Endnotes, which I think was the one that she most enjoyed as a contribution to this debate. And that text is all about, it's not a heroic argument that we can just take all of the infrastructure and then make it communist or whatever we want to do with it. It's a different kind of argument about the materiality of infrastructures, whether those be like habits or systems of energy. And the idea is just that even within the languages of engineering, any infrastructure always has a margin of error. And the margin, Marina is suggesting, following this Endnotes piece, is the place where we might move, right? So there's always this space of possibility which is not exhausted by its use within capital. That space isn't infinite, and we can't just click our fingers and turn everything which currently oppresses us into the basis of our liberation. But it's the source of a potential experimental practice, experimental collective practice in politics and in art. And I think that's kind of where Marina was pushing towards when she started the work on what became the project, Infrastructural Critique. And in terms of the collective and the refusal of the individual, you know, like I say all the time, I'm going to agree with you by saying something that kind of sounds the opposite, or like an inversion, maybe. I don't know. Like I say all the time, like Marina was committed to the collective and not the individual, and it's not about hagiography. I'm not saying Marina was a stupendous genius and we can all, which is something that happens when people die, you know. But I do think there's certain ways in which she was singular, as I said before, and in which her singularity was inspiring, really inspiring to me. And like one of them is the way that she just really loved working with other people all the time, lots of different people, in as many ways as possible, and yet still was always bringing back her own ideas, not giving up on the prospect or the horizon of the consistency of a theoretical project, but trying to like bring that project into conversation with as many people as possible. And I just don't think many people do that, or I find it difficult to do it, and I find her love for doing it very beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Danny. What I'm gonna say now is like the movement that you kind of created with what you mentioned kind of brought this thought, and I'm gonna really try to bring it in now, but I have to mention something about the exhibition in Kunsthalle, just for the sake of the argument, to bring the point, because that's the movement your text created. And I really wish that I would have read the text, because I think you would have put it in really better words. So part of the workshop thing that we were doing was like this object that was a trapdoor, or like a attic stair that would leave, that was like a sort of a trapdoor attic stair. And we wanted to put that on the display and make an opening on the display of the institution that was closed by wooden plates. Mm-hmm. And this was one of the first proposals that was rejected because it was not possible to open the display of the space, like due to like damage and stuff like that. And the funny thing was that when then we were like discussing the, like, I mean, not that this was the only part, but like when we wanted to talk about like concept of the workshop, when they rejected that, they suggested that then now we can have the trapdoor on the institution display. So it was, and then when you were talking, I was like thinking, okay, because when you were talking about institutional critique being image and representation, and therefore it is so easy to be like swallowed, and then also this connection with like what we were talking about, which was like the genocide. I was thinking it's like a far-fetched idea, but I'm just putting it there as you requested that to help you understand. Is that I was thinking maybe this whole project of Aufarbeitung and like reckoning with the Holocaust in German-speaking countries has become this thing of the same thing, like not the same thing, but like somehow there is a way to think about like, okay, how it's absorbed now, something that was supposed to be there for like to prevent genocide that is now somehow absorbed, because on a I mean, it's a thought that it just shaped right now by your speech, but like I'm thinking maybe thinking through our times actually might be a way to understand how infrastructural critique could help us understand the time, and vice versa, or like, I don't know, I'm just putting it out there. Just
yeah, you have helped me, Anahita. Thank you. Yeah, I mean that's so fascinating to me on like so many levels. So yeah, like I've completely forgotten that the work was also a portal or a window or a door of a kind, or a step, a step ladder. It had that relationship to all of the other works that I ended up talking about. It's like, it's very interesting, again, in really simple and crude terms, that you were told that you couldn't do that. And then when you tried to do something else they didn't want you to do, were told that you could. It's like a miniature lesson in the like direct action gets the goods. You extract gains from institutions by confronting them with demands that they don't want to fulfill. And maybe they're not the demands, they don't fulfill the demands that you put to them, but they give you other things that they don't want to give you. I think Marina would really enjoy that. And what you're saying about Aufarbeitung and traditions of thinking about history as singular catastrophes that have no relationship to other events, including the events of our immediate present, that's just the opposite of thinking about historical movement, right? It's history as congelation, to use the verb that Kirsten used earlier. It's like a deep freeze. History happened, and then it stopped, and then we just look at it forever, which is a lie about what history is. So yeah, of course, Marina's thinking is opposed to that way of relating to historical time.
Yes, please. Also with, you will definitely have your question, but I want to say also with in prospect of 2 further full days, and cautious of the energies for the next 2 days. So maybe we have this question and one more, and then, yes, go ahead, please.
I just like 2, but maybe it's like form some kind of speculative unity in my mind. One is they're both more or less like curiosities. The one is were there social movements? It seems like there was this like global proliferation of social dissent around, during her life of writing. And I was wondering, I was curious if there are like particular, maybe even kind of like counterintuitive social movements or events in the world that maybe like she that were like very kind of like held her attention or kind of came up a lot. And the other question is just about the role of intuition. It's more of a speculative question, but it seems to me like there's something like I want to say it's a dialectical category. But it also could be an anti-dialectical category. But I just think it's like systematicity at the highest level, and then I don't know. There's something so incredibly intuitive about the movement of her thinking. I don't know. Yeah, that's it.
Those are both really interesting questions to me. I think social movement, I mean, it's hard to know where to stop in relation to the first part. And I guess in her own words, she would say that, but this is really just the beginning, that her first book, Speculations of Mode of Production, Forms of Value, Subjectivity in Art and Capital, really came out of this post-financial crisis moment. And then also the movements against austerity that followed that. And in her thinking about infrastructure, even at the theoretical level, it's not hard to make out many of the major events of the last 10 years. I mean, it's almost too obvious to point them out, but I mean, Marina was deeply concerned with the war in Ukraine. Her family were like bombed out of their homes, her extended family. And she was very involved in forms of trade union struggle at her university during the pandemic. And her real focus on like work and working in relation to practical struggle, I think, emerged out of that experience. In some ways, I think the theory gets less theoretical because her life became less theoretical and her relationship to struggles became more direct. And what you say about intuition, I think that's really yeah. I really want to think more about that. For me, the point of connection there is it's another dialectic besides the one between the negative and the propositional within movements, and it's instead the dialectic between the totality and the gap, and the idea that you're always oriented towards a totality. There is one social reality. Everything is connected. All forms of struggle against forms of oppression can in principle be synthesized and have to be if there's to be a successful movement for another kind of social world. But you can't just do it. And the gaps between existing movements, existing forms of art, social practice are real, and you also need to recognize them for what they are and kind of use them too. So perhaps intuition is a way of navigating the gaps rather than pretending that they don't exist, which is what we would be doing if we were to say, well, like here is my depiction of the whole world and what needs to be done to it in order for us to accomplish change. But I think there's lots more that you could say about intuition. It's interesting.
I also would like to make a question, maybe the last one, if nobody else is
Go for it.
Okay, I think it makes a good bridge with the last one, because I wanted to stress out also and go back to this part of the lecture where you talked about the different languages that Marina was speaking, and about how to use all the different languages, like in theory, in practice, in different native languages as well, and how we can work with broken languages as well. That goes into this trajectory to work with the gaps, to work with the ruptures, to work with the cracks in the institution, and not go for a total explanation. And even when we share a common language, maybe, or when we found some connection points, then there is some things where translation or, like, say, mediation fails, because sometimes, for example, do we have the same notion about what is anti-Semitism, what is a genocide, what is violence, what is critique, what is infrastructure? I mean, we can have different approaches to that and open different doors, but sometimes language fails because there are other, let's say, suitcases that we have with us, each of us, that enables or not enables these languages of connection. And because you said it's very important also in Marina's thoughts to try to find the connections, to make the compartments and not go for the universal, but also to make these connections visible, or the ruptures. So is that?
I think I share that interest with you in that, like, the way in for me in a way is language, because that's mainly what I think about or work on. And I suppose the thing that I realized in a kind of flash while trying to understand the gap, you could say, between Marina's thinking about the traditions of modernist art and their contemporary life in art institutions, and the histories of Black radicalism, or the work that exists in the On Looting volume. What I realized in a kind of flash, maybe this is simple, often things that you realize suddenly or belatedly are, is that all of the stuff is language. It's the non-conceptual language of things that is everywhere in Marina's work. And perhaps also in her relationship to political practice, insofar as political practice always, in the end, takes place in a world of things, or matter, or stuff, or infrastructure. And for me, that feels like a way of reaching out, in a way, from my starting point with language towards the thing that seems like the thing I can't understand, because I don't know anything, actually, or I know very little about contemporary art. Realizing that the language actually is everywhere, and it's certainly everywhere in Marina's thinking. And that what we think of as language is often just the language of empty abstract concepts, like all of those terms that you just named, which can mean anything to anyone, if they aren't grounded in a material social reality, which is made up of things.
Thank you so much, Danny, in working with us, getting us started, moving us. And we will continue tomorrow at 10:30 sharp. You are all welcome from 10 o'clock. The doors are open. And yeah, well, thanks a lot, Danny. Danny Hayward.